Good morning. I'm Sean McManus, and on behalf of the Cronkite family and Walter's colleagues at CBS News, I'd like to welcome you to what I think will be a very fitting and lasting tribute to someone whose stature and influence will never be duplicated. I'd like to welcome and thank President Obama and President Clinton for joining us here this morning, and also Walter's children, Nancy, Kathy, and Chip. I'm also happy to report that Walter Cronkite IV is gainfully employed as an intern in our Washington bureau, so the Cronkite tradition is alive and well at CBS News. We began today with the Marine Marching Band playing Stars and Stripes, which is appropriate because Stars and Stripes was Walter's favorite march, and also because Walter was one of only two civilians, the other being John Philip Sousa, who conducted this great band. So thank you very much for that great performance. My family has had the good fortune of periodically crossing paths with Walter throughout the years. My dad, better known as Jim McKay, worked with Walter on a number of shows in the 1950s at CBS News. And in 1960, Walter was actually a last-minute replacement for my father, who was scheduled to anchor his first Olympics, the 1960 Summer Games in Rome. My father became ill and unable to travel to Rome, and Walter filled in for him. Years later, Walter and I talked about how much he enjoyed his big sports assignments and my dad's desire to be a network news anchor. Walter said to me, "You know, Sean, if things had worked out a bit differently, perhaps I would have been the sports announcer and your dad would have been the news anchor." However, I think they did just fine in their respective careers. In 1972, in Munich, I accompanied my dad back to his hotel after he'd been on television for 18 hours straight, reporting on the massacre of the Israeli Olympic team. I still remember it as if it was yesterday, walking into the hotel just as the sun was coming up, my dad asking for his key at the front desk and being handed an envelope from Western Union. My dad opened it up and read it to me. It said, "Jim, you were superb yesterday. The profession and the industry have reason to be proud of you. Congratulations, Walter Cronkite." It was the very first of hundreds of notes that my dad received from America, and it was typical Walter, simple, but so perfectly worded. My dad and I just looked at each other for a while without saying anything. Then my dad said to me, "You know, it's never going to get any better than this moment right now." Many years later, when I got my job at CBS News, I was in my office in the morning of the announcement, calling the various anchors, correspondents, and the rest of the CBS News team, when my assistant came in and said, "Walter Cronkite is on the phone for you." Of course, I immediately stood up at my desk at attention, took a deep breath, and picked up the phone. "Good morning, Mr. Cronkite," I said, and he replied, "Hello, boss." I literally gasped and said what first came into my mind, which was, "Oh, please don't call me that, Mr. Cronkite." The fact that I could somehow be Walter Cronkite's boss seemed to be the height of absurdity. However, as soon as we finished our conversation, of course, I immediately called my parents and said, "You're not going to believe who just called me boss." When I told them, there was a long silence, and I knew that the three of us were thinking how the McManus-Cronkite family history had really come full circle. From those early days at CBS News in the 1950s to the day Walter called to congratulate me on my new job. Like all moms, mine had the best advice for me. You just make sure you call him Mr. Cronkite and not Walter. At our first lunch, I did indeed call him Mr. Cronkite, and not surprisingly, he insisted that I call him Walter. I can't imagine what it would be like to come to work every day and actually be able to work with Walter Cronkite. Those of us in the news business are instinctively influenced every day, not only by his remarkable body of work, but by what he stood for also. Integrity, perspective, professionalism, and yes, a sense of humor. And that's why Walter fared so well, and why no matter what the story he was covering, his demeanor, his reporting, and his presentation were virtually flawless. His enormous professional accomplishments aside, it's also important to remember that there was a warmth and a compassion about Walter that is almost indescribable. Those who knew him will also tell you that there was never a better or more loyal friend. All of us at CBS News will continue to miss Walter, but how lucky are we that in some small way we're able to carry on the tradition and the rock-solid foundation that he built for us, and not just for those of us at CBS News, but for everyone in the news business. In a remembrance in the New York Times, Vernon Klinkenberg summed up perfectly what the life of Walter Cronkite means to us all. He wrote, "Some deaths end only a life. Some end a generation. Walter Cronkite's death ends something larger and more profound. He stood for a world and a century that no longer exists. His death is like losing the last veteran of a world-changing war, one of those men who saw too much but was never embittered by it. Walter Cronkite's gift was to talk to us about what he saw, and we were very lucky to have been able to listen. I would say we were very, very lucky indeed. Thank you very much."